You know, if someone came to you and said they're in a relationship and they have fear of that person they're in the relationship with, that would almost always be bad. Certainly you have a person. The only exception is when you're in a relationship with God. The Bible talks about fear of the Lord and how it is something we should have. And we looked at that last time. Well, there's something else that's also appropriate to our relationship with God. Part of what happens as you realize He's God. And when many people understand this, that it's part of that relationship, they say, I don't want the relationship. What is it? Well, first let's understand why it's part of this relationship with God, and it has to do with our roles. In a relationship with another person, there's an appropriate element of give and take. With my wife, we decide we want to go somewhere to eat, and so, I say, where would you like to go? And she says, where would you like to go? And you've probably been there. It goes back and forth. But it's the idea. I don't want to always be the one that says, we're going here, we're going here. Same thing, she doesn't want to either. We get ready to watch a movie and wait, that's sort of the same thing. What do you want to watch? What do you want to watch? But neither one of us insists on it. That's the idea, that there should be this give and take there. But with God, there isn't give and take. Now, there is give from God to us. The nature of our relationship is God blesses us and provides for us. We worship and glorify Him. But again, it's not us insisting on, hey, God, it's my turn to get what I want. He's God. We're not. The what that's appropriate is total surrender. My surrender to Him because of who He is. That's the roles in that relationship. Well, that's the reason I mentioned these words, and it's what ties together Mark chapter 5, the beginning of it, with the end of chapter 4. In Mark chapter 4, we saw that initially the disciples were afraid of the storm. They had this word delos, afraid of the loss of courage because of the storm. But then when Jesus calms the storm, it says they had great fear, and that's a different word. It's phobos. It's the word that's used for fear of the Lord. But I said it can also have the meaning, and often does in the New Testament, of withdrawing from the Lord, withdrawing from His will. And those two really go together. When you realize who God is, you're faced with this choice. Am I going to surrender to Him or withdraw from Him? And we see this in Mark chapter 5, when Jesus and the disciples land on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. It says immediately they're met by a demon-possessed man. And this man, the demons, there's more than one, and there's legion in him, it says, up to thousands maybe. He is supernaturally strong. The townspeople have tried to restrain him, and it says he's able to break the chains and break the shackles. And so just think about the townspeople, what they knew about him and, his reputation, so to speak. Well, Jesus cast out these demons. It says it cast them into a herd of pigs. Well, the news spreads. It says in Mark chapter 5, verse 14, the herdsman fled and told it in the city and in the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described it to them, what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs, and they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. Now, this word for afraid in verse 15, unfortunately, the ESV doesn't keep it consistent, because it's not the word that was afraid in chapter 4. It's not that cowardliness, the delos. It is the phobos. And here's where you see they're faced with this choice as well. They don't know Jesus is the Son of God. It seems like the people here are predominantly Gentile, but they know from what He's done, how He's brought this man back to a normal state of mind, that He's more powerful than all the demons that were in him. And so they realize, okay, if we have any relationship with Jesus, even if we just let Him stick around for a while, the only thing that's appropriate is surrender to Him. And they're faced with that choice, and they don't want to. And so it says they beg Him to depart from their region. That idea of withdrawing from the Lord and His will, well, they say, you withdraw from us. You please depart. They know they can't tell Him to because of who He is and His clear power, but they beg Him to depart. Well, think about it for us today. Again, many times people are faced with a relationship with God, with starting that relationship, and they choose not to, not because the evidence isn't there for a God and Jesus and what He's done. They don't want to surrender. Sometimes they're honest about this, not too often, but I remember a church member saying, she shared Jesus with a friend, and that person said, yeah, I get it. I don't want to give up what I'm doing. He didn't want to surrender. Most of the time, people aren't so honest, but it's the underlying reason. Romans tells us in chapter 1, verse 18, and I'm reading from the Young's literal translation, so it'll sound a little awkward, but I like the way they translate this word. It says, "For revealed is the wrath of God from heaven upon all impiety and unrighteousness of men, holding down the truth in unrighteousness." Other translations say suppressing men. It's the same idea, but I like this idea, holding down the truth. Or they know it's the truth, but I don't want it to get up. I don't want to accept it. I'm going to hold it down. It's this choice of I'm faced with, all right, the fear of the Lord, surrendering to Him because of who He is or not. And many people choose not to. But it's not just non-Christians and choosing not to become a Christian. Oftentimes for us as Christians, we're faced with maybe you could call it a new level or a new area of surrender, and we say no. We're faced with surrendering to God in some new way in our life, and if we choose not to, which sometimes we do, it means we aren't truly surrendered in general. We've sort of retreated, we haven't fully surrendered. But as we come to realize who Jesus is, what He wants of us, again, we're all faced with that choice. Am I going to surrender, the only thing that's truly appropriate, or am I going to say no and withdraw or say, Jesus, you need to depart when it comes to this? Well, the Bible often talks about, and I mentioned a faith choice, are we going to have faith or not? This tells us we're faced with a fear choice. Which kind of fear? As we come to see who Jesus is more and more and more, all right, I'm faced with, am I going to react with a fear of the Lord type fear or this withdraw from me God type fear? And really it's a faith choice as well, because the fear of the Lord, it demands that surrender. That's a key part of faith. Faith is relying on God and surrendering to Him. And so I'm faced with, am I going to do that or am I going to refuse to surrender? The choice is going to be ours. And here's one thing I'll say is in my experience, and this could be true of just about all of these videos, if not all of them, when we're made aware of something, God puts us in a situation where we're faced with that choice. And so looking back on this series, we're going to be faced with a situation where, okay, am I going to be afraid or have faith? As I am faced with, am I going to be afraid of the situation? Okay, as I see God act, as I've seen Him act, am I going to have the fear of the Lord that's appropriate to that? And then with this one, all right, that fear of the Lord, part of that, knowing who He is surrendering to Him or not. I just want to warn you, you're going to be faced with these choices. And it's up to you which one you make, but certainly the one that God wants you to make in His best. And we see that in the passage. I think of these people, and we don't know what Jesus would have done if He was there even for a while, but you think of all the people He healed, they missed out on Jesus being there because they chose not to surrender. We'll miss out as well, either eternally if we never make the choice, or abundantly if we don't surrender to everything God puts in our path.